When the McCauley family moved in next door, it barely registered as a ripple in the monotonous pool of my life. I was the quintessential suburban nobody, a 38-year-old accountant with a 2-story house, 2 cats, and a failed marriage that refused to leave my headspace. Life in Willow Creek had always been predictable. Comfortable. Until it wasn't. The McCauleys arrived on a crisp September morning. I remember it vividly because I was trimming my hedges when their moving truck groaned to a halt. The man, tall, pale, and pinched-looking, stepped out first. He wore a charcoal gray suit, a suit for moving day. His hair was jet black and combed so precisely it looked unnatural, like a wig glued to his scalp. Following him was his wife, a thin and tired-looking woman, her mouth fixed into a tight, nervous smile. 2 kids, a boy around 8 and a girl who couldn't have been older than 5, clambered out of the car. The boy clutched a stuffed bear, his knuckles white. The girl just stared blankly at the ground, unblinking. I remember thinking how strange it was that neither of them looked at their house, no excitement or curiosity. Just a blank submission, as though they already knew it wasn't their home, just another stop on a journey they didn't want to take. We exchanged the customary neighborly nods, but something about Mr. McCauley's eyes made my stomach knot. They were sharp, ice blue, and they lingered, like he was trying to see something beneath my skin. After they settled in, life went on. But it didn't take long before I started to notice things. The noises started first. I'd always been a light sleeper, cursed with a habit of waking up at the slightest disturbance. The first time I heard it, I thought it was an animal, a raccoon or a coyote rummaging through trash. A faint scratching sound, followed by a low thud, then a dragging noise. It was past midnight, and I sat up in bed, listening. The sound was definitely coming from the McCauley's house. I crept to my window and peered through the blinds. Their kitchen light was on, glowing faintly through the curtains. Silhouettes moved inside, 2 figures, standing close. One of them, I assumed, was Mr. McCauley. The other. I wasn't sure. It looked smaller, hunched, with jerky movements. I strained my eyes, but just as I thought I'd make something out, the light flicked off. I told myself it was nothing. People move around at night. Maybe one of the kids had trouble sleeping. But the noises continued. Every night, I'd wake to the same sounds. Scratches. Thuds. Dragging. Sometimes, a soft tapping noise, as if someone were knocking on wood, over and over again. And then the boy disappeared. I was in my backyard trimming the ivy that threatened to take over my fence when I noticed it, how quiet the McCauley house had become. The boy, whose name I'd never learned, was usually in the yard during the afternoons, sitting on the swing set the previous owners had left behind. He never swung. Just sat there, bear clutched to his chest, staring at the ground. But now, the swing was empty. A week passed. Then 2. No boy. No bear. On a particularly restless Sunday, I decided to confront Mr. McCauley under the guise of neighborly concern. He answered the door wearing the same immaculate gray suit, not a wrinkle in sight. A faint, almost metallic smell drifted from inside. "Good afternoon," I said, trying to sound casual. I noticed I haven't seen your son outside lately. Is he all right?" Mr. McCauley tilted his head, a thin smile curling at his lips. "Oh, he's fine," he said, voice smooth as glass. "Children tire of old routines. You know how it is." I forced a nod, my throat tight. "Right. Sure. I just wanted to check. Kind of you." He didn't blink. Not once. As the door shut, I caught a glimpse behind him, of the little girl, standing at the base of the stairs. Her wide, empty eyes locked onto mine. She raised a single finger to her lips. "Shoo." From that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, terribly wrong. The noises at night grew louder. More urgent. Sometimes, I'd hear faint whispers woven through the thuds and taps, like multiple voices speaking too softly to understand. The little girl vanished next. It happened so quickly that I almost didn't register it. One day, she was in the yard, staring up at the sky with those same blank eyes. The next day, the yard was empty. No swing. No bear. No children. But what made it worse was what I saw when I went to take my trash out that evening. The McCauley's garage door was cracked open. From my driveway, I could see Mr. McCauley inside, kneeling on the ground. He had something in his hands, a small, dark bundle wrapped in a blanket. He was whispering to it, cradling it, as if soothing a baby. And then, he placed the bundle inside a box. He closed the lid. And he smiled. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart drumming like a wild animal in my chest. I didn't want to know what was going on in that house. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. At precisely 2:13 a.m., I slipped out of bed, pulled on my shoes, and grabbed a flashlight. The neighborhood was silent, save for the hum of streetlights. I crept into my backyard and climbed the fence. From there, I could see the McCauley's house looming in the dark. The back door was ajar. I swallowed hard. My palms were slick with sweat as I approached. The faint smell I'd noticed before, metallic, wet, was stronger now, leaking out through the open door. My flashlight shook in my hands as I stepped inside. The kitchen was spotless, every counter and appliance gleaming like it belonged in a showroom. But the smell was everywhere now. It turned my stomach, making my throat burn. I followed it. The basement door was open. From below, I heard the familiar sound. Scratching. I don't remember descending the stairs. I don't remember turning on the light. But when I did, I froze. The basement was lined with boxes. Each one was neatly labeled, stacked in perfect rows along the concrete walls. My flashlight skittered over them, and I felt the bile rise in my throat. The labels weren't dates. Or numbers. They were names. And the last box at the end of the row was open. Inside, nestled among folds of dark, damp cloth, was the boy's stuffed bear. It was covered in blood. The air in the basement pressed against me, thick and heavy, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing. The beam of my flashlight shook violently as I stared at the bloodied bear in the open box. The silence was total, yet I could feel a hum, something, beneath it, like an inaudible vibration filling my ears. I turned sharply, my breath shallow. The boxes stretched into shadows I hadn't noticed before, stacked so high they looked ready to topple. Each was labeled, deliberately, painstakingly, with a single name. Names I didn't recognize. Names that didn't belong to the McCauleys. What the hell is this? I needed to leave. The realization hit me like ice water. I needed to get out of this basement, out of this house. My heart was pounding so loud that it muffled the sound of my own breathing, the floor creaking beneath my feet. I turned toward the stairs, aiming my flashlight up. And then I heard it. A low, guttural whisper, words I couldn't make out, spilled from the far corner of the room, where the light didn't reach. I froze. My hand gripped the flashlight so tightly that my knuckles ached. I am not alone. The whispering grew louder, rising and falling like a strange, rhythmic chant. A scraping sound followed it, something dragging itself slowly across the concrete floor. I swung the beam of light toward the corner, and my throat closed. Something moved. A shape, small and hunched, jerked violently out of the darkness, crawling on all fours. Its movements were unnatural, insect-like, the joints bending in directions they shouldn't. For a split second, the beam caught its face, too pale, too smooth, and impossibly featureless. A gaping slit where a mouth should have been stretched and trembled, whispering the sounds I couldn't understand. I stumbled backward, a scream trapped in my throat. Run. The thing began to crawl faster, its limbs twitching and slamming against the floor. I turned and sprinted up the stairs, my flashlight bobbing wildly, throwing erratic beams against the walls. I felt something brush against my ankle, thin and cold, and I nearly fell face first onto the steps. I crashed into the kitchen, gasping, my limbs trembling. I barely noticed that my hands were slick, sweaty or bloody, I wasn't sure. The basement door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the walls. And then, as if nothing had happened, the house fell silent. I don't know how I made it back home. My memory of those moments is a jumbled blur of darkness, open air, and blind panic. When I finally stumbled through my front door, I locked it, bolted it, and slid down to the floor. My chest heaved, my pulse hammering so loudly I swore the neighbors would hear it. I didn't sleep. The images replayed in my head on a loop. The boxes. The names. That thing in the corner. The sound of its hands, or claws, scraping against the concrete floor. I told myself I should call someone. The police, maybe. But what could I say? That my neighbor was keeping something in his basement? That his kids had vanished, and I'd found a stuffed bear soaked in blood? That something inhuman had chased me up the stairs? They'd think I'd lost my mind. At dawn, I forced myself to peer through my blinds at the McCauley house. It sat there, quiet and innocent as ever, bathed in the soft glow of morning light. The curtains were drawn. The swing in the yard hung still. There was no sign of life. I didn't see Mr. McCauley leave for work that morning. In fact, I didn't see him at all. For the next 2 days, I barely left the house. I spent my time pacing, flinching at every noise, and watching the McCauley's place through the window. The silence surrounding their house was wrong, like the whole building was holding its breath. Then, on the 3rd day, someone knocked on my door. The sound jolted me out of a half-sleep on the couch. I sat up, my neck stiff and my heart racing. It was late, well past midnight. The knocking came again. 3 soft taps. I stood, every instinct in my body screaming at me to ignore it. But I couldn't. My legs carried me to the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole. Mr. McCauley stood on my porch. The porch light washed him in pale yellow, his features stretched and angular like a wax figure left in the sun. He wasn't smiling. His face was blank, expressionless, as he stared straight ahead. "Mr. Dalton," he said suddenly, his voice muffled but clear. "Are you awake?" I didn't answer. He knocked again, 3 times, slow and deliberate. "You've been very curious," he said softly. "You shouldn't be." I swallowed thickly, my back pressed against the door. "Why don't you come over for a drink?" he continued. "I have something I'd like to show you." I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. I didn't move. A long silence followed. Then, finally, I heard him step off the porch. I waited several minutes before daring to look through the peephole again. The porch was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The following morning, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep living like this. I had to know what was happening in that house. I had to finish this. Armed with nothing but a crowbar and my flashlight, I waited until nightfall. When the streetlights flickered on and the shadows grew long, I crept out of my house. The McCauley's back door was unlocked, just like before. It swung open easily, as though the house was waiting for me. The metallic smell hit me immediately, strong enough to make my eyes water. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped inside, moving quickly to the basement door. It stood open, yawning blackness into the kitchen. I descended the stairs one last time. The basement was silent. The boxes were still there, each one exactly where I'd left it. But something had changed. The open box, the one with the stuffed bear, was now closed. And sitting beside it, in the dark, was Mr. McCauley. He turned his head toward me, his face obscured in shadow. "I was wondering when you'd come back," he said softly. My fingers tightened on the crowbar. "What is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What are you doing down here?" He stood slowly, his movements fluid and unnatural. "You've seen too much," he said. They know you've seen too much. Who? He smiled then, wide, impossibly wide, revealing teeth that weren't teeth at all, but jagged slivers of something else. You'll meet them soon enough. And then, from the rows of boxes, the scratching began again. Only this time, it was coming from inside the boxes. The sound of the scratching swallowed me whole. It was relentless, dozens, no, hundreds, of sharp claws raking against wood. It came from all the boxes at once, a chaotic chorus of scraping that set my teeth on edge. My flashlight trembled as I swung it wildly across the room, my brain struggling to accept what I was hearing. The noise grew louder. Faster. Desperate. I took a step back. My foot landed on something soft, and I stumbled. My flashlight beam fell to the floor. The stuffed bear. It lay at my feet, its head torn nearly off, its button eyes staring blankly at me. I jumped back, my breathing ragged, my heart a pounding drum in my ears. From across the room, Mr. McCauley watched me. Or it watched me, whatever he had become. His silhouette stood unnaturally still, too rigid, like a mannequin. When he stepped forward, his movements were a jerky snap of limbs, like his body was a marionette held by unseen strings. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. His voice was soft and lilting, almost sing-song, but wrong. It reverberated in the walls and floor, buzzing like static. But it's too late now. The boxes rocked violently, as though something inside was pounding to get out. I could see it, shadows shifting behind the lids, fingers, hands, clawing and scraping at the thin wood. "Stop this!" I shouted, raising the crowbar like it might help. "What the hell is happening? What's in those boxes?" Mr. McCauley tilted his head, his face still mostly hidden in shadow, but I could see the glint of his teeth, long, jagged, hungry. "They are mine," he said softly. "They were chosen." I stumbled back another step. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Something was keeping me there, something bigger than fear. The room felt heavy, like the air was thickening, pressing down on me with invisible hands. From the boxes came new sounds, soft whispers, rising and falling in an eerie unison, like a prayer or a chant. "Help us." The voices were faint, almost drowned out by the frantic scratching. They came from inside the boxes. My throat went dry as I turned to look at them. "Help us," the whispers repeated. I turned back to Mr. McCauley, the crowbar shaking in my grip. "Who are they? What did you do to them?" His smile widened, stretching his face to an inhuman length. "I didn't take them. I saved them." "Saved them?" I choked out. "They were lost," he said. "Their lives didn't matter. But here, they serve a purpose." I glanced at the boxes again, the whispers growing louder. "Help us. Please. Let us out." I couldn't stand it. My pulse was a roar in my ears as I rushed to the nearest box. My crowbar dug into the edge of the lid. "No!" Mr. McCauley's voice boomed, low and deep, shaking the room like a thunderclap. "You do not open them." I ignored him. With a scream of effort, I pried the crowbar downward. The wood groaned, splintered, and cracked. I flung the lid off and stepped back, my flashlight focused on the contents. And what I saw made my blood turn to ice. Inside the box was a child. Or what had once been a child. The body was twisted, emaciated, its limbs unnaturally long and bent at sickening angles. Its skin was gray and paper-thin, stretched so tightly over its bones that it looked ready to tear. The thing's head was bald and smooth, its mouth hanging open, revealing rows of jagged teeth, just like McCauley's. Its eyes were hollow pits of blackness, and yet I could feel it staring at me. It opened its mouth, letting out a low, wheezing breath. "Help me," it whispered, in a voice that sounded like a dozen others layered over one another. I screamed, stumbling backward. From the rows of boxes, the lids began to splinter and shake. One by one, they cracked open. The whispers turned to wails, a sound so gut-wrenching I could feel it in my bones. McCauley laughed, a horrible, gurgling sound that echoed through the basement. "You've set them free," he said gleefully, his voice reverberating off the walls. "They're hungry." The creatures, what used to be children, began crawling out of the boxes, their thin limbs jerking and snapping as they moved. Their mouths opened wide, their heads twisting unnaturally to face me. Their hollow eyes stared into me, through me. I turned and ran. The basement steps felt endless as I scrambled upward, their screams chasing me. I could hear the scratching of their claws against the concrete floor, the thump-thump-thump of their bodies slamming against the walls as they pursued me. I burst into the kitchen, my shoes skidding on the linoleum as I fumbled for the back door. Behind me, the basement door slammed open with a deafening bang. I didn't dare look back. I threw myself outside, sprinting across the yard and crashing through my fence, my hands bleeding as they scraped against the wood. I didn't stop running, not until I was back in my own house, locking every door, every window, every possible point of entry. I sank to the floor, my back against the door, gasping for breath. My mind raced as the sounds of scraping and whispering echoed faintly in my ears. And then, silence. I stayed there for hours, gripping the crowbar until my fingers went numb, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing came. When the sun rose, I ventured to the window, my body aching. The McCauley's house sat in eerie stillness, bathed in the golden light of morning. The basement windows were dark. No sign of movement. No sign of them. It's been 3 days now. I haven't slept. I haven't eaten. I haven't dared to go outside. I don't know where McCauley went. I don't know where those things are now. But I hear them. At night. The scratching has started again. Not at his house. At mine. The scratching started softly at first, like fingernails tapping gently against a wooden surface. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, willing it to stop. It's in my head, I told myself. It's just my imagination. But it wasn't. The sound grew louder, closer, until it echoed through the walls of my bedroom. A slow, deliberate scraping, like something clawing its way toward me from deep within the house. I shot upright, my skin slick with sweat, and strained to pinpoint the noise. It was coming from the basement. My basement. The realization made my chest tighten. I hadn't been down there since I moved into this house years ago. It was unfinished, just cold concrete and cobwebs. There was nothing down there. Nothing. But now, something was. I grabbed the crowbar from the corner of my room, the same one I'd used to pry open McCauley's boxes. My hands trembled as I gripped it, the weight of the metal somehow reassuring. I moved cautiously through the dark house, every creak of the floorboards making me jump. The basement door stood at the end of the hallway, shrouded in darkness. As I approached, I could feel it, something, on the other side. The air was colder here, and I swear I could hear faint whispers drifting up from beneath the door. I placed my hand on the doorknob, hesitating. My pulse thundered in my ears, my body screaming at me to turn around, to run. But there was nowhere to go. Whatever was in the basement, whatever followed me home, wasn't going to leave me alone. With a deep breath, I turned the knob and opened the door. The basement stairs were shrouded in darkness. My flashlight cast a narrow beam that trembled as I descended, step by agonizing step. The scratching grew louder with each creak of the stairs, echoing off the concrete walls like some demented symphony. When I reached the bottom, I froze. The basement looked different. The single light bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered weakly, barely illuminating the space. In the corners of the room, shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting and writhing as though they had a life of their own. The faint metallic smell I remembered from McCauley's house hit me again, stronger this time, burning the back of my throat. And then I saw them. The boxes. They were here, lined up neatly against the walls, identical to the ones in McCauley's basement. Each box was labeled with a name, written in the same careful handwriting. My flashlight skimmed over the names, my stomach turning as I recognized the last one. David Dalton. My name. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as the scratching began again, inside the boxes. The lids trembled, and I heard the whispers rise, soft, pleading voices calling my name. David, help us. I shook my head violently, my mind racing. No, I whispered. This isn't real. This isn't happening. The nearest box splintered suddenly with a loud crack. I jumped, my flashlight swinging toward it just in time to see something crawl out. It was one of them, one of the things I'd seen in McCauley's basement. Its limbs were long and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its hollow black eyes locked onto me as it dragged itself forward, its teeth clicking together in a sickening rhythm. I staggered back, the crowbar slipping from my grip. The creature let out a low, rattling breath that sounded almost hungry. More boxes began to shake, the lids splitting open as the whispers turned into wails. The creatures crawled out one by one, their twisted bodies jerking unnaturally as they moved toward me. David, they whispered. You shouldn't have opened the box. I turned and ran. I crashed up the basement stairs, my bare feet pounding against the wood. Behind me, I could hear them, clawing, scraping, following. The whispers were deafening now, layered voices screaming my name over and over. I slammed the basement door shut and threw the bolt. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against it, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the flashlight. The scratching started again, on the other side of the door. Slow. Persistent. I backed away, my entire body trembling. The whispers were still in my head, swirling like a cyclone, making it impossible to think. I stumbled into the living room and collapsed onto the couch, curling into myself as the sound echoed through the house. Scratch. 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 I don't know how long I sat there, staring blankly at the floor, my mind slipping in and out of coherence. Hours, maybe. The scratching never stopped. The next morning, the sound was gone. The house was silent again. I sat up slowly, my body aching, my mind clouded with exhaustion. Sunlight streamed weakly through the windows, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been a nightmare, a vivid hallucination brought on by too many sleepless nights. But then I noticed the door. The basement door was open. The bolt had been torn clean off, the wood around it splintered and broken. I stared at it, my heart sinking into my stomach. They were out. I stumbled to my feet, my legs weak and unsteady. I needed to get out of this house, to get as far away as possible. I grabbed my keys and threw open the front door. And froze. Standing on my porch, dressed in the same immaculate gray suit, was Mr. McCauley. His pale face stretched into a wide, impossible smile, his ice-blue eyes boring into mine. "Good morning, David," he said softly. I couldn't speak. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted. He stepped forward, his smile never faltering. "I told you, didn't I?" he said. "You shouldn't have opened the boxes." I stumbled back, my vision swimming. "What do you want from me?" I choked out. He tilted his head, his expression almost pitying. "It's not about what I want. It's about what they want." I blinked. In that brief second, Mr. McCauley's face seemed to shift. His skin darkened and cracked, his teeth lengthening into jagged shards. I could see the shadow of something inhuman lurking beneath his skin, something vast and ancient and hungry. "You let them out, David," he whispered. "Now you have to feed them." I slammed the door shut in his face and locked it, my hands trembling violently. I don't know how much time I have left. The scratching has started again. Not just in the basement, but in the walls, in the floors, in the ceilings. The whispers are everywhere now, calling my name in voices I don't recognize. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see them. Crawling. Waiting. I don't know what McCauley was, or what I've unleashed. All I know is that they're here. And they're hungry. And soon, they'll come for me. The scratching had spread to every inch of the house. It came from the walls, the ceilings, even the floors beneath my feet. No room was safe. The whispers, soft, pleading, and wrong, were inside my head now, repeating my name over and over like a broken record. David. David, feed us. I couldn't think anymore. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the twisted children crawling out of those boxes, their hollow black eyes staring, their broken mouths whispering things I couldn't understand. They were waiting for me. Watching me. But the worst part? I was beginning to understand what they wanted. I spent the next day pacing the house like a rat trapped in a maze. I tried to leave, twice, but every time I opened the front door, Mr. McCauley was there. He stood on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, his pale face stretched into that same impossible smile. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched me. After the second attempt, I stopped trying. There was no way out. The house had become a living thing, an organism that had swallowed me whole. I could feel it pressing in on me, the walls vibrating with the scratching and whispers. My head throbbed constantly, the pressure unbearable, like something was trying to get in. By nightfall, I knew I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to end this. The crowbar was still sitting in the living room, streaked with dust and rust. I picked it up with shaking hands, my pulse pounding in my ears. My plan was simple: go back into the basement, find whatever this was at its source, and destroy it. I didn't know what I'd face down there, but I couldn't live like this anymore. If I'm going to die, I'll die fighting. I descended the basement stairs slowly, the flashlight cutting through the darkness in jittery arcs. The scratching and whispering followed me, growing louder as I reached the bottom. The basement was no longer my basement. It had changed. The walls were lined with boxes again, dozens of them stretching into the shadows. The names were back, written in that familiar spidery handwriting. Some of them I recognized, my neighbors, my co-workers, but others were unfamiliar. The last box was still the same. David Dalton. The air felt alive, like it was buzzing with invisible static. The smell, metallic and rotten, made me gag, but I pushed forward. My flashlight beam wavered as it landed on the center of the basement. Mr. McCauley was waiting for me. He stood there, tall and stiff, like a shadow that had slipped out of place. But he wasn't right. His body was bending in impossible ways, his head twitching and tilting unnaturally. His mouth was open in a wide grin, teeth too long and jagged, like shards of broken glass. "They're hungry, David," he said softly, his voice echoing unnaturally off the walls. "You've kept them waiting long enough." Behind him, the boxes began to shake violently. The lid splintered as the creatures, the children, began clawing their way out. Their limbs jerked and snapped as they pulled themselves free, their hollow eyes locked on me, their mouths whispering, "Feed us. Feed us. Feed us." I stumbled back, my chest heaving, my flashlight beam jumping erratically. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, gripping the crowbar so tightly my fingers went numb. Mr. McCauley stepped forward, his body moving like a puppet yanked by unseen strings. "It's simple," he said, his voice a sickening blend of softness and malice. "You opened the boxes. You set them free. Now you must feed them." The creatures began crawling toward me, their long fingers scraping against the concrete floor. The sound, that sound, made my skin crawl. I turned and ran. But there was nowhere to go. The basement stairs weren't there anymore. The path I'd taken to get down had vanished, replaced by cold, unyielding walls. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the room. The creatures were closing in, their mouths open impossibly wide, teeth clicking together in a grotesque rhythm. I swung the crowbar wildly, striking the nearest one. Its head snapped back, bones crunching, but it kept crawling toward me, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. "Feed us." "No!" I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "Leave me alone." But they didn't stop. They swarmed me, their broken limbs wrapping around my ankles, my wrists, pulling me down to the cold floor. I thrashed and fought, but there were too many. Their whispers were deafening now, 1,000 voices pouring into my ears, drowning my screams. Through the chaos, I saw Mr. McCauley standing over me. He watched silently, his head tilted, his mouth stretched into that monstrous grin. "You've been chosen," he said. "They will take what they need." The creatures pulled me closer to the open box, the one with my name scrawled on the lid. My body screamed in agony as their claws dug into my skin, dragging me toward the darkness inside. I understood then. The box wasn't just a box. It was a door. A passage to somewhere else, somewhere cold and empty and endless. "Please," I choked out. "Please, don't." But it was too late. I felt myself pulled inside, the darkness swallowing me whole. The last thing I heard before the lid slammed shut was Mr. McCauley's voice, soft and gentle, like a lullaby. "Sleep now, David. You're finally home." They found my house 3 days later. The police came after a neighbor complained about the smell, something rotten seeping out from the cracks in my basement windows. They searched the house, top to bottom, but they didn't find me. What they did find was the basement. The boxes. Each one was empty, except for one. The last box sat in the center of the room, closed and nailed shut. My name was written on it, clear as day. They didn't open it. They didn't dare. And next door, the McCauley house sat quiet and empty once again. For sale signs went up a week later, but no one bought it. People said it was cursed. That the last family who lived there had disappeared without a trace. No one remembered Mr. McCauley. No one remembered his wife. Or the children. But sometimes, late at night, the neighbors hear scratching coming from deep inside the walls. And if you stand in just the right place, under the pale glow of the streetlights, you can see him, tall and still, standing at the window, smiling. Waiting.